Please listen closely to Mr. John Salza, who uses facts and not feelings to set the record straight on this important topic.
Good morning, John.
Good morning, Joe.
Welcome again to the Voice of Catholic Tradition.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's always good to speak to you, John. John, this morning I would like to discuss an article that appeared in our local diocesan newspaper, and I believe in many diocesan newspapers around the country. It was written by George Weigel, a well-written and publicized author, leading biographer of Pope John Paul II, and without a doubt a relentless apologist for the Second Vatican Council. And my motivation, John, this morning is twofold. First, I sense here in Mr. Weigel a form of resentment concerning any attempt to reunite the Church with tradition, and in evidence of this particular article that we'll discuss this morning, and also his criticism of Pope Benedict in the past when he lifted the alleged excommunication of the 4 bishops of the Society of Pius X. He wrote quite a strong article and considered it in criticism of the Pope as premature. And secondly, that this is an article, and I'm sure you'll be able to address this, though somewhat accurate in some areas, is filled with half-truths and prejudiced evaluations of the meetings of the Society and of its followers. And though I've read and enjoyed many of his writings, I believe, John, in this case, time must be taken to evaluate this particular article. And I'd like to ask you first, John, your reasons for agreeing to this interview. Maybe you can explain to our listening audience what your purpose is here today.
Well, I'd be happy to, Joe. I'm doing this interview, and I've done interviews in the past on this because I perceive an injustice here that's being committed against fellow Catholics. I'm not a spokesman for the SSPX, and I'm sure that most priests in the society don't even know who I am. But as an aside, neither is Mr. Weigel a spokesman for the Pope, even though I think some people get the impression that he is. But I'm doing this interview to clarify for our Catholic audience who are confused about these matters, perhaps they're drawn to the old Mass, they're drawn to the Society, that Weigel's comments are inaccurate, they're irresponsible, and they're divisive. And because they're divisive, I believe they're going against the spirit of Pope Benedict, who is trying to restore the Church to tradition, and he's trying to regularize the canonical status of the Society. And for whatever reason, Weigel is fighting this restoration. It obviously bothers him, and he's swimming upstream. And I think he's beginning to realize that the current Pope doesn't share his views about the post-conciliar condition of the Church. So that's why I want to do this interview.
Well, I appreciate that, because we're looking for an unbiased opinion here, and we've spoken to you on another matter in earlier time, and the response I got from many listeners was that your evaluation was very unbiased and very honestly open, and that's why we came back to you a second time. And I appreciate your return to our program, John. I'd like to point out something from the very middle of his article. And I'll quote George Weigel, which to me seems to indicate the problem that we have. And I quote, he said, "It is not easy to see how the Catholic Church is to be theologically enriched by the ideas of those who, whatever the depth of their traditional liturgical piety is, those who reject the mid-20th century reform of Catholic thought." And John, does this statement, in essence, asking your opinion, present a prejudice framework within which Mr. Weigel discusses tradition and any attempt to deal with tradition?
Well, it certainly does, Joe, and it's interesting. What Mr. Weigel is saying is he's saying that Vatican II reformed Catholic thought, okay? This is the issue. Dogma cannot be reformed. It can only be clarified. So if Mr. Weigel is saying that Vatican II reformed Catholic thought, then he's admitting that Vatican II did not teach dogmatically, because dogma cannot be reformed, you see? So, ergo, he cannot accuse the Society of St. Pius X, or anybody else for that matter, from dissenting from the dogmas of Vatican II, because no such dogmas were defined by the Council. The contentious issues that the Society is currently discussing with the Holy Father on religious liberty, on ecumenism, on collegiality, ecclesiology, etc., these were not dogmatized by the Council. So these teachings are subject to debate and subject to reform, and that's why the Holy Father, in his decree lifting the excommunications, said these are necessary discussions. in the still open matters. Well, if all the doctrine was settled, as Mr. Weigel claims, then the Pope wouldn't call these discussions necessary. There'd be nothing to discuss. The Pope clearly acknowledges that many of these conciliar texts, and he did this as a cardinal as well, that there are some ambiguities and there are some efforts needed to try to reconcile some of these statements in these texts with preconciliar teaching. That's what this issue is about.
So in his article, John, when he refers in one spot to, in criticism of ideas that came out of what he quotes as Vatican insiders, he says, the teachings of Vatican II here are not under joint review. And you just explained, well, why can't they be? And based on the situation you are describing, why can't they be under review?
Of course they can, because they're not infallible. Even the Pope, Pope Paul VI, when he closed the council, said this is a pastoral council only. Cardinal Ratzinger said the same thing. We're not talking about dogma, because I would agree with Mr. Weigel on that point. This isn't about negotiation if it's about dogma, because dogma is non-negotiable. Okay? But some of the pastoral teachings that the council put forth, again, on ecumenism, religious liberty, etc., these are subject to reform. They're subject to discussions. That's why the popes have referred to these as necessary discussions. After all, this is what it's all about. The Mass has been liberated. The excommunications have been lifted. That's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning. That prepared the venue to finally talk about the real issue. It's the doctrine of the Church. That's what this issue is about.
All right, well, now that we're talking with that, and you've raised that question, just to take from this article, he raises some points, and I'd like to have you address them one at a time. He said, does the Society of Pius X accept the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on religious freedom as a fundamental human right that can be known by both reason and revelation? What do you have to say about that?
Well, of course the Society does, but this is Mr. Weigel's effort, I believe, to pull the wool over the eyes of ignorant Catholics who haven't read the documents. Because Vatican II taught much more than what Mr. Weigel just described. The document that he's referring to, Dignitatis Humanae, and I've written an article about this that was just published in the Remnant newspaper, teaches that a man can publicly profess error, which, by the way, can corrupt the souls of Catholics, and that this is a right which is based upon his dignity and his nature. Now, I can tell you, the Church has never taught such a thing. Nobody's disputing the fact that people have a fundamental right and can't be coerced into believing what they do not want to believe. But it's quite another thing to say that man has a right to adhere to error, which is a God-given right based upon his dignity and his nature. In fact, the current catechism, Joe, says that man does not have a right to adhere to error. This is just the type of thing that the Society wants to discuss with the Pope, and the Pope has recognized, again, this is one of the contentious ambiguities in the conciliar text that has to be resolved.
So we're dealing with a dual definition of religious freedom here, then.
We are. I mean, as I read Dignitatis Humanae, I've read it for years. I've tried to reconcile it with many of the preconciliar teachings, and I believe that the document extends the Church's teaching. And what I mean by that is, before the Council, the Church had always taught that the state can tolerate citizens from adhering to religious error, so long as it doesn't upset the common good. But nowhere did the Church ever say that man has a right, a civil or moral or otherwise, a right to profess religious error which could corrupt the souls of Catholics. So I see a new teaching here where the Church, or at least the Council, is saying this isn't about state tolerization. This is about state legitimization of religious error. That's a fundamental issue that has to be resolved.
I see, and you've clearly demonstrated that issue has to be defined properly, and Mr. Weigel is just throwing it out there for those who might not fully understand that definition. Now, the other point he makes, he raises this point: does the Society of Pius X accept that the age of altar and throne alliances, confessional states, and legally established Catholicism is over, and that the Catholic Church rejects the use of coercive state power on behalf of its truth claims?
Well, Joe, I really find this to be an incredible claim by Mr. Weigel. I must say, it's almost if he's calling into question or even maligning the infallible teaching of the Church on the social kingship of Jesus Christ, which was laid down by Pius The 11th in Quas Primus, which held that Christ is head of nations and states. In fact, Pope Leo XIII, in his document Annum Sacrum, said that Jesus is king even over those outside the church. And if you read Blessed Pius IX's syllabus, his condemnation of errors, one of the errors he condemned was as follows, and this is in number 77. He condemned the error or the thought that the Catholic religion should not be held as the only religion of the state to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. He condemned that idea. And it appears to be that Mr. Weigel may be holding to that error. It's hard to tell, but I'll also add this. I've seen Mr. Weigel on national television say that the state is not competent to make theological judgments and declare that Christ is king. And he even says that that's the thought of John Paul II. Well, where did John Paul II ever teach such a thing? Where did the Second Vatican Council ever teach such a thing? It didn't. In fact, Dignitatis Humanae says that it's preserving the traditional teaching in reference to the social kingship of Christ. But this is what I think Mr. Weigel's missing when he says that the state is incompetent to make theological judgments. First, the church is not asking the state to be competent in making theological judgments. The church teaches that it makes the theological judgments and the state must submit to its judgment. That's the ideal form of government. That's what the church teaches. I would also add that if Mr. Weigel says that the state is incompetent to make theological judgments, then is he saying that the state cannot declare that life begins at conception? The state is not competent to make that theological judgment, because that is a theological judgment. So this just tells me that, when you abandon the church's teaching, which, he may have, I don't know, I'm not accusing him of that, but just based on his words, when you abandon the teaching of the church, you fall headlong into many errors.
Yeah, because this is an extremely strong statement. We discussed this earlier, that it's a denial. I'll say it's practically a denial of the kingship of Christ, or even the possibility of the kingship of Christ. Am I correct?
The state is a creature subject to Jesus Christ. Okay? All things, all nations, all states, all individuals are subject to the kingship of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. That is the perennial and infallible teaching of the church. And to me, with his statement, he's calling that teaching into question.
Right. In other words, he's saying that we have to get real. The SSPX has to get real, get with it, in terms of understanding that situation.
Well, Blessed Pius IX would sure have something to say about that.
I think so. Another point, John, and here's where things get a little touchy because of recent developments and when we start dealing in labeling people. He says, does the society accept the Council's teaching on Jews and Judaism as laid down in Vatican II's Declaration on Non-Christian Religions? And does the society repudiate all anti-Semitism? And now he's getting into the anti-Semitic accusations that have been thrown around. And how would you interpret what he's saying here?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, Joe. I think this is a pot shot at the Williamson affair, and
yes, definitely.
It doesn't really dignify a rebuttal. What I will say is this, and I will hold Weigel to his inquiry. Mr. Weigel, what does Vatican II teach about the Jews that the Church did not teach before? The answer, nothing. The Council says that the Jews pressed for the death of Christ. The Council says that the Jewish leadership was responsible for Christ's death. And the Council says that the Jews must convert to the Catholic faith to save their souls. That's what the Council says. That's what the Church teaches. And then Mr. Weigel intimates that there is a change in the Church teaching on the Jews or any other, non-Christian religion, shows that really he doesn't understand the Council's teaching, and I think he's embracing the false ecumenism of the age.
Right. And what you just said would be interpreted by many Novus Ordo individuals as anti-Semitic.
It's not at all. It's
not at all.
It's a loving act of charity.
Absolutely.
We can say the same thing about Catholics who've grown lukewarm in their faith, right? You better shape up and come back to Christ. Again, the Church in these documents is not accusing of Jews at large of the death of Christ. Christ died for all of us, for all of our sins, but the Church did reiterate that historically speaking, the Jewish leadership at the time, as a majority, were responsible for his death. That's just an historical fact. That's not anti-Semitic at all.
Not at all. And that has, we've heard accusations where even the restoration of the Good Friday prayer is anti-Semitic. And this is, like you say, and you said it well, John, this is a cheap shot. It's always one that, it's thrown out there to raise some eyebrows. And I think that's what Mr. Weigel was attempting to do. One other point. Does the society, he says, does the Society of Pius X accept the Council's teaching on the imperative of pursuing Christian unity in truth, and the Council's teaching that elements of truth and sanctity exist in other Christian communities as well as in other religious communities?
Well, 2 points on this. First of all, this shows that Mr. Weigel doesn't understand what the Council taught, because that's not really what the Council taught. The Council taught that truth and sanctification, elements of it, can exist outside the visible structure of the Catholic Church. It didn't say that truth and sanctification exists in other communities as communities. That's not what the Church taught, and the Church would never teach such a thing because that's false. Outside the visible structure means that Trinitarian baptisms and marriages are valid outside of the visible structure of the Church, but they're still Catholic sacraments, okay? Otherwise you'd have to call into question the Church's infallible teaching that there's no salvation outside the Church. So just the way he phrased that question shows he doesn't understand Church teaching. The other thing, Joe, I would say is I find it ironic that, Weigel is purporting to be a proponent of Christian unity. Well, then why is he maligning the Society of St. Pius X? Why is he calling them schismatics? Why is he calling them disobedient? Why is he calling them into question? They're already Catholic and in communion with the Church. I find that statement to be ironic. He's promoting Christian unity, and yet he's calling the lay faithful of the society schismatic and disobedient. I mean, that's not about Christian unity. That's about promoting division between traditionalists and non-traditionalists, which, again, I maintain is contrary to the wishes of Pope Benedict XVI, and I find it hypocritical.
You raise an excellent point here, and this is exactly the road I'd like to go down briefly. The term schismatic, another label just thrown out there. He says that the followers of the SSPX are more confused than they are schismatic, and he refers to Schism, and he refers to another term, Lefebvrists. That's another one. When you hear that, the Lefebvre Society, you know what's coming right after that line.
Of course.
Could you discuss the schismatic question that we're dealing with right now?
Well, there is no schism at all. Even when John Paul II issued the excommunication, he still permitted the lay faithful to attend SSPX chapels if they were desired the old Mass. I mean, this is what his Ecclesia Dei Commission sanctioned. And of course, the Church, the Holy See, would never allow Catholics to attend a Mass of a schismatic because they would be worshiping outside the Church and unable to fulfill their Sunday obligation. So all these charges of schism, and it's nonsense. It's a divisive statement. It's a false statement. Where does the Pope say that the SSPX is in schism? Nowhere. Where does the Pope say that the society is living in disobedience? Nowhere. Where does the Pope call these people schismatics and disobedient? It's not in any of the documents. In fact, the Pope, our Holy Father, refers to the priests of the society as priests, as brothers, as faithful. This term Lefebvre is a pejorative moniker, as if the priests and the faithful of the SSPX follow a bishop and not the faith of all time, okay? Would Mr. Weigel use the same pejorative language with other Christian groups, like Anglicans, for example? I mean, I just, again, find it ironic, if not hypocritical, to call objective heretics, and I'm talking about those who willfully reject the papacy, to call them brothers in Christ, but to call faithful priests and bishops Lefebvrists and schismatics. This is an injustice.
Well, he seems to look at that group that you're describing. He uses the term, we are angry traditionalists. He said these meetings are not a concession to angry traditionalists by a pope who might share some of the concerns of traditionalists. Now, is he refusing to accept the possibility that the pope might, and I say might in quotes, might agree with some of our concerns? Is this a possibility?
Seems to be the case, Joe. Yeah, I mean, we're not angry. We're living in the peace of Jesus Christ. We have the old Mass. We have the faith of all time. And on the one hand, on the other hand, I think maybe we are a little bit angry for the way that we've been unduly marginalized. Those who try to adhere to the teachings of the Church have been in the confusion of the post-conciliar era. But when you look at it, Look at all the families that attend these chapels, and I'm just talking about the society, but I'm talking about the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. I'm talking about the Institute of Christ the King.
Absolutely.
Look at these parishes. Look at these churches. They're filled with Catholics, faithful Catholics with large families who pray the rosary, who follow the church's teaching on sexual morality. Who's living in disobedience, and who's really confused here?
The term disobedience seems to be, and I've had conversations with people who are quite knowledgeable on what's going on, but that's the term that keeps coming up. And maybe we could discuss here briefly, and you have discussed this before on other interviews, and even with us, and maybe if we could time to review it. What was the basis of the term that they're using, disobedience? What did Archbishop Lefebvre do that is determined to be disobedient?
Well, Archbishop Lefebvre decided to consecrate 4 bishops to preserve the tradition of the Church, including the Old Mass. He believed there was a state of necessity, and who could argue with him? Certainly many canonists, many canon lawyers, many theologians, looking at the state of the Church, the state in which the Church is in, recognize that there was a state of necessity. And this, Joe, is the fundamental issue here between people of Mr. Weigel's persuasion and people who hold our views. They do not admit or understand that there is a crisis in the Church, or at least they don't understand the nature and the extent of the crisis. There are no vocations other than in traditional orders. Baptisms are down, missions are down, mass attendance has dropped from 80% to 20%. Catholics don't believe in the real presence. Tabernacles have been removed. Lay people are ministering Christ's body and blood. Sexual morality is ignored. Okay, this is the state of the Church. The Church is in a crisis, and the only solution, which Archbishop Lefebvre recognized and many people recognize, is a return to tradition. A return to the teaching and practices that nourished the faithful before the post-conciliar era began, when these problems didn't exist, certainly did not exist to the extent that they exist today. That's why I believe the Pope says these are necessary discussions. This is a doctrinal crisis. I think we've lost sight of that. This is a crisis about who Jesus Christ is. He is divine. He's the Son of God, and His Church is divine as well. And one must be a member of the Roman Catholic Church to save their souls. Everything flows, I believe, from the belief in the divinity of the Son of God and the divine nature of His Church. That's where we need to return.
Now, absolutely, John. And you just mentioned something that, and this is what I would say, if you had to pinpoint one specific idea that confuses most traditional Catholics, why do you think there is a refusal to admit that there is a crisis? If you were to read Weigel, and you read any of his other stuff, and then his book, The Courage to be Catholic, and so many other writers, why do they simply ignore what the crisis in the Church is? Is this a psychological defense?
Well, modernism, I believe, is a disease of the mind, of the intellect, and I believe it's rooted in pride. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of being a modernist, but that's the disease of modernism. But I always like to give people the benefit of the doubt, Joe. And what I might propose is that they love the Church so much that they can't admit that the Church went wrong with the Council, and with the new Mass, and with the new liturgy, and with, the revisions to the sacraments, and the new liturgical worship. That could be it. It's a very difficult and painful, once you've invested your life in what Mr. Weigel is doing, it's painful. It's difficult to admit that there is something wrong in the Church, isn't it? I think giving them the benefit of the doubt, that could be the motivation. It's simply too painful to admit.
Because we aren't exactly dealing with a Church that has been somewhat successful since the Second Vatican Council. You very quickly summarized the horrors that have developed. I mean, we're losing everything that we held true, and we're losing, especially with the destruction of our schools, the ability to pass on the true Catholic faith. And the schools are practically gone, and even those who call themselves Catholic on the upper level, they are barely Catholic, only Catholic by identity at best. And you question, where does, as the saying goes, if you don't recognize an illness or a problem, you will never solve the problem. And it seems that sometimes that we're in that situation. What do you feel about that? That will we solve this problem with those who refuse to accept the identity of the problem?
Again, I believe it's a doctrinal crisis. And that's because our faith and our piety, Joe, are based on doctrine. Even the Mass, our form of religious expression and worship, must be based upon dogma. Otherwise, it's a house built on sand. That's why I believe this is a doctrinal crisis. We have to get into the conciliar texts and resolve the open issues, as Pope Benedict referred to them, as open matters. And he says to reach a solution that was posed in the origin. What he means by that is this was a doctrinal crisis from the very beginning. The Pope went backwards by first liberating the old Mass and the excommunications, and now he's getting into the doctrinal issues. But what I mean by that, and we could spend so much more time on it, we don't have that time, when you read, and much of the Second Vatican Council's teaching, by the way, is very good. I don't know what the percentage is, but we might say 90-95% is it reiterated prior infallible teaching.
Yes, it did.
But some of the teaching that was posited on a pastoral level, and I mentioned it, ecumenism, religious liberty, and these very positive appraisals of non-Christian religions. These types of teachings have given some the impression that the Church's former teaching on no salvation outside the Church may not be what it was, that maybe it's somehow being compromised or being modified, you see. And it's almost what the Council didn't say that's the problem. Because when the Church says, for example, that truth and sanctification can be found outside of our visible structure, okay, fine. But why stop there? What good is that element of truth and sanctification for the Protestant who lives in rebellion against God's holy church? What good is it for that person?
Right.
It's not good at all, because that person is risking damnation if they willfully reject Christ's church. Let's call a spade a spade. But the Council didn't go that far, you see. Again, in its pastoral approach, it refused, quite consciously, to condemn error and to highlight and to dogmatize these truths. And so a lot of this leaves things open-ended. I believe that's where we need to have, the theologians, the brilliant minds that exist within the Church, both within the society and within other traditional orders, to review these texts. We're going to need clarification from the Church. Pray that it happens under the reign of Pope Benedict, but if it doesn't, that it happens soon.
Right, so we need definitely a clarification of ambiguity. That's basically what we have to do here. We have to set the record straight as to what is and what is not in terms of doctrine.
That's right, because religious liberty was not dogmatized. Ecumenism was not dogmatized. The Church's official appraisal of non-Christian religions, that's not dogmatized. What does it mean? Again, it's giving some the impression that what the Church taught before is different than what the Church is teaching now. And this is exactly what Cardinal Ratzinger said as Cardinal. He said some people have the impression that Vatican II is somehow what he called a super dogma that revokes all previous teaching, that somehow we're starting from ground zero. And he says that is absolutely not what the Council could do, much less did do.
Well, there's no doubt about it. If you read the Vatican II apologists, you sometimes get the feeling that the Catholic Church began with Vatican II, and that what came before has had to be reviewed and corrected. And I think that's part of the problem we're dealing with here. And if you look at this article, and he makes one little statement here, we're running out of time, but there's a little something I'd like to put in here. He believes that these meetings, not negotiations, he reminds us, these meetings were held simply to invite the Society of Pius X back into the Church. Do you think that this is the simple purpose, that they're just getting together to propose an invitation to come back into the Church? But we'll end it on that note.
Yeah. Why did the Pope refer to these as necessary discussions, and why has the Pope himself acknowledged the ambiguities of the conciliar texts? Obviously, the Pope understands what the society and what people outside of the society have been arguing for the last 50 years. So no, this is not just a charitable gesture. The Church is going to go on. This is about doctrine. This is ultimately about doctrine, and I think sometimes it's painful for us to admit that the Church probably did go wrong with some of these texts, and we need to get back on the right road.
Absolutely, John, absolutely. And John, I'm looking at my watch here, and there we go again. I want to thank you for bringing a clearer presentation of the difficulties that currently exist between tradition and the post-conciliar church. And I'm sure that this discussion that we've had here this morning has helped our audience understand the nature and the objectives of these meetings between the Society and the Vatican.